Now, this is the kind of crowd that we seldom get in the United States, partly because of our media, which avoid advertising things like this and keep us pretty much shunned from what we call the mainstream media. And let me just make this point right in the beginning, that having been in Washington 52 years now, I've seen a lot of change. But there's one change that dwarfs all the other changes in importance, and that is that we no longer have, in any real sense, a free media, and that is big. That could not be bigger. Thomas Jefferson, he was asked, if you had a choice between a government and a free press, what would you choose? He said, no problem, free press. Because without a free press, you're going to get a dictator, okay? So that's really big, and it plays into everything that we are going to be saying tonight, because unless you are well accustomed to finding the truth, it's very, very difficult indeed to find it, and it's even more difficult to discuss things with your neighbors who only read the Washington Post or the FAZ. It used to be, when I was stationed here, I could read the FAZ and I'd find out what's going on. Right now, it's very different. I read the one over the weekend, and there's Flüchtlinge, 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 and nobody asks, warum ist die Flüchtlinge? So our topic is, wie werden heute Kriege gemacht? Und a subtitle would be, wie werden heute Flüchtlinge gemacht? We were at the Bahnhof just yesterday, and Elisabeth, who speaks fluent Arabic as well as German and Spanish and I don't know what else, she was talking, she was having a little chat with some of the Flüchtlinge there in Arabic. It was very moving. There were people trying to help, and our respect goes out to Frau Merkel and others who realize that we need to extend, well, what was the slogan there? Alle Menschen haben die gleiche Rechte, you know? But to think about why these Flüchtlinge are here, that is dangerous, because it might talk about how the United States attacked Iraq and destroyed that country. It might talk about what's happened in Syria, how that country has been destroyed. 4 million Flüchtlinge from Iraq. 2 million had to leave their homes and stayed in Iraq, 2 million in the surrounding countries. Syria, again, 4 million. I mean, these boggle the mind. So please keep that in mind as we go through our little thing here about wie werden heute Kriege gemacht. The answer is pretty simple. Lügen, lügen, lügen. And we're going to be able to tell a little bit about the lüge that we experienced and why it is. People ask us, you know, they say, Elizabeth, when did you decide to be an activist? When did you have a conversion? And they asked me the same thing. When did you fall off your horse on the way to Damascus, right? And I say, I didn't change. We were in a very honorable profession, intelligence analysis. We were set up, we were given career protection for telling the president the truth. Now, that was what we were used to. What changed? We got corrupt presidents and we got corrupt directors of Central Intelligence. That's what changed. And as soon as we were able to retire, we did so, and now we feel it our Pflicht, you know, our duty to spread the truth around here, because it's so hard to get it in the mainstream media. So let me just give a little background here. The first time I encountered the corruption, or one could say the prostitution of intelligence, was during Vietnam. Now, I knew that my colleagues held that there were 500,000 Vietnamese communists under arms in South Vietnam. But General Westmoreland he wouldn't accept any more than 299,000 Viet communists under arms. And so I asked my friend Sam Adams, who is responsible for this area, I said, Sam, it doesn't make any sense. Generals need to exaggerate the threat from the enemy. Why is Westmoreland diminishing the threat from the enemy? And he said, Ray, he said, with the kill count, we're killing so many hundreds each week, each day sometimes, and the press in Saigon is not really bright, but they can do arithmetic, And so if we tell them now that it's more than 299,000, well, there was a cable. Now, General Abrams, who was an excellent tank commander under Patton in this country and in Italy, he was really bright, but he wasn't, he was a really good tank commander, not so bright in terms of politics. He wrote a cable, and I will quote from it. He wrote a cable on the 20th of August, 1967, and it said, we can't possibly accept the higher numbers of the enemy, quote, because we have been projecting an image of success in this war, and there's no way that we could avoid the press from drawing an erroneous and gloomy conclusion, period, end quote. There it was, in black and white. There were twice as many enemy in South Vietnam, and the political generals were deliberately disguising that and saying there were only half as many as there were. Why? Because then they couldn't project an image of success in this war. Now we're going to get around to ISIS, okay? And the same thing is happening today. But let me just do it sort of like in a little bit of order. We had Vietnam. I gave you an example of how intelligence was really controlled by the Army and not the CIA, and how the president probably ordered that these things be kept from Congress. So let's go ahead to Iraq. Now, when Elizabeth and Elizabeth was still on active duty, when we saw our profession of intelligence analysis being corrupted for the express purpose of deceiving our elected representatives out of their constitutional prerogative to declare or otherwise authorize war, well, it doesn't get any worse than that. This is what Nuremberg warned about, the Nuremberg Tribunal after World War II. They talked about a war of aggression, and they defined it. And they said a war of aggression, is the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes only in so much as it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. Okay, accumulated evil of the whole. What could that mean? Could they mean like kidnapping people off the streets of Italy? Could they mean like moving them to black prisons hidden from sight? Or maybe torturing them? There's a lot of accumulated evil going on, folks, and we decided that we needed to blow the whistle on that, and we formed a little group called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and we started preparing memoranda for the president, as we used to do on active duty, so to speak. Memorandum for the president, subject, Iraq, with Colin Powell's speech. That was our first memo, and from VIPS. So lots of things happened before Iraq, and I was watching from afar, but the web being what it is, I could figure it out, my friends could figure out what was going on. There was great pressure on intelligence analysis to come up with the correct answers. And Elizabeth, my colleague here, had direct experience in this, and I've suggested that she might want to share the kind of pressure that she experienced as a branch chief, a very responsible job in one part of the agency. Would you be able to do that? Okay.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, so in the period before the United States attacked Iraq, which was March 2003, sort of before and during the war, I was the branch chief in charge of media analysis for Iraq in the Central Intelligence Agency's open source center that monitored all the media. So we were monitoring the speeches of Saddam Hussein and analyzing the Iraqi press. And in the weeks just prior to the war, my office received a call from the office of Deputy Defense Secretary Paul Wolfowitz. And the request that I received from this office was that we should look in Iraqi media for the connection between Al-Qaeda and the government of Saddam Hussein. So when I received this request, we had to go out to our bureau in Amman, Jordan, where we monitored Iraqi media, and to all our other sort of contacts, media contacts in the Middle East. And we searched everywhere in Iraqi media for evidence of a link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and we found absolutely none. So I went back to Deputy Defense Secretary Wolfowitz and said, no, we don't have any evidence of that. And I thought that would be the end of things. But about 2 weeks later, our office received exactly the same request. Again, please find us the link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. So again, we exerted every effort. We pulled out all the stops, so to speak. And again, the response came back, sorry, we can't find anything. There's no evidence of this connection. So oddly enough, we kept getting this request until it became very evident to me that our office was not providing Wolfowitz with the correct answer. So this is just a small example of the kind of pressure that we were starting to come under. And I finally advised my superiors that I was going to go back to Mr. Wolfowitz's office and ask them, what is the original source of this allegation? Maybe it would help us in our search if you could tell us where you got this idea in the first place. And of course, the office of Paul Wolfowitz never got back to me on that. And that's just a small example of the kind of subtle political pressure that analysts within the CIA and in the intelligence community at large were starting to experience in the run-up to the war.
So we get an idea of a personal experience of being leaned on really, really hard. Now, to their credit, Elizabeth's folks refused to change the conclusion. But our former colleagues on the strategic side were asked to say that there are weapons of mass destruction there, and they caved in. First time in my experience of that 27 plus years where responsible managers and analysts said, in effect, Mr. Tenet, he was the head of the CIA, the president wants us to cook up intelligence to start a war. We can do that. Just tell us how soon and what to say. And the answer came back loud and clear. We're talking early September 2002. The answer was, no problem. You have to do it in 2 weeks, and the conclusions have to come out to be exactly what Vice President Cheney said on 26th of August 2002, where he talked about Saddam Hussein on the verge of a nuclear weapon, having all manner of chemical and biological weapons and so forth. Now, if the director had told us in our day that we had to do a piece of intelligence, in quotes, like this, we would have said, George, you're kidding, right? I mean, okay, right, yeah, you're kidding, George. And if he said, no, we have to do this, and we have to do it this way, we would have been out of there. We would have left that room. There might be a couple of sycophants that hung around, but he would have known that he had an insurrection on his hands because we didn't do that kind of stuff. It's a long story how the CIA managers of intelligence became corrupted. Suffice it to say, it started with Bill Casey under Ronald Reagan and was fostered by a fellow named Bobby Gates, who used to work for me actually in the 70s. And I think he became, what did he become? He became head of the CIA, and didn't he become the Minister of Defense as well? Yeah. If you smell the prevailing winds and tune your sails accordingly, you can get up pretty high. Anyhow, that was corrupted. And when we say in the United States, it's a saying, there are 4 words, and I'm going to say the first 2. And you're going to probably guess at the second too. You ready? Okay. After 9/11, okay, give you another hint. After 9/11, everything changed, right? Everything changed after 9/11. So, whereas before we used to do honest intelligence, no longer was that necessary because now the president had a pretext, ein Vorwand, to make war in Iraq. How was he going to do that? He was going to corrupt the intelligence to draw a line between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And when the war started, 69% of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was partly responsible for 9/11. Okay? That's as bad as it gets. Now, this wasn't the fault of Elizabeth and our honest folks. It was the fault of the press mostly and the leaks that the government made. Now, I want to make a point here. It was not only foreign policy that was affected by Bush and Cheney's rather crass attempt to play on the basest instincts of Americans after 9/11. Revenge, okay? It could have been quite different. We could have looked on, well, why is it that these people hate us so much? And you know, the answer, they hate our freedom or they hate our democracy. Yeah, that doesn't wash. They hate what we do. They hate our policies. They hate our support of dictators in that part of the world, and they hate our total identification with the State of Israel. Now, on the other side of this is the domestic situation where they saw an opportunity to clamp down on our civil rights. And we have this Bill of Rights in the Constitution, 10 amendments, and they're really golden. The first one is why I can speak here freely to you. And the second, well, the fourth one is supposed to protect our internet and our telephone conversations. That's been violated. And the fifth one is, no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Whoa, wow. Well, does that mean you're not supposed to kill American citizens like Awlaki? Well, it used to mean that. But now the Attorney General, the head of the law part of our government, tells us, well, no, it says due process. It doesn't say judicial process. And so we do the due process right here in the White House. Thank you very much. We don't need the courts. Hello? That's as bad as it gets. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of clips here. They're only about a minute each, and I hope that no one falls asleep because this is on the exam, okay? And these are very brief, and they have to do with what's happened with NSA and our inner freedoms. Now, I hope this will work. We'll see what it does. Okay, Michael Hayden was the head of NSA, and when Dick Cheney went to Michael Hayden, NSA being the National Security Agency, and said, Mike, after 9/11 everything's changed, and so we're gonna monitor all American conversations and you know, other conversation and also the emails. Would you do that? Now, General Hayden, like me and like Elizabeth, took a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But this Air Force general, to his great disrepute, saluted smartly and said, sure, I can do that. And later he's justified that by saying, well, he could do whatever he wanted because of 9/11. Now, after it became clear that General Hayden was doing all this stuff, and we can thank James Risen, one of the best journalists ever in our country, for writing a book about it, okay? Now, one interesting aspect of that is that he got this story early in 2004. Now, in 2004, there was an election. Bush was running for re-election. And James Risen went to his betters there in the New York Times and said, hey, I got an incredible story. They're monitoring all the telephone calls in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Let's go. Now, the New York Times used to be an independent newspaper. Now they ask the president if they can publish something like that, okay? And the answer came back, no, this, you know, Well, suffice it to say that the New York Times was as important a factor in Bush's re-election as any other factor. They suppressed it. They suppressed it until James Risen went to his betters in December of 2005, okay, a whole year later, and he said, look, I got this book coming out. It's going to be a little embarrassing. You're paying me big bucks to write for the New York Times, and you won't run this story, but it's in the book, and the book's in galleys, it's being produced. So the head of the New York Times went down to the White House at the president's request. He said, you know, we're sort of between a rock and a hard place here. It's kind of very difficult. We're going to have to publish this story. And Bush said, no, you can't do that. And he said, well, we're going to do it anyway. And so the story came out. Now, that's all sort of a prelude to showing who they appointed as the point man to explain what NSA was doing. And the point man was a fellow named General Michael Hayden. And I hope this works. It's only a minute long, or a minute 25 seconds, so please listen carefully.
My understanding is that the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution specifies that you must have probable cause to be able to do a search that does not violate an American's right against unlawful searches and seizures.
Actually, the Fourth Amendment actually protects all of us against unreasonable search and seizure.
But
that's what it says.
The measure is probable cause, I believe.
The amendment says unreasonable search and seizure.
But does it not say probable?
No.
The court standard, the legal standard,
search and seizure.
the legal standard is probable cause.
Just to be very clear, okay, and believe me, if there's any amendment to the Constitution that employees of the National Security Agency are familiar with, it's the Fourth, right? And it is a reasonableness standard in the Fourth Amendment.
To quote the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States in its entirety, the one the General and the NSA folks are so familiar with and know is about reasonableness and not about probable cause, quote, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, no warrant shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Well, maybe they have a different constitution over there at the NSA.
Now, we show you that to show you how the leadership of our community has been lying through its teeth on internal matters as well as external matters. And there's one gentleman named James Clapper, I use the word gentleman loosely, who was in charge of interpreting satellite photography before Iraq and couldn't find any WMD because when his people said, well, this immigration says there's a production of chemical weapons at this coordinate here. When we looked, we couldn't find it. It was actually a chicken coop, you know? So what Clapper did was keep out of the intelligence the reality that despite all these billions of dollars that have been spent on very sophisticated collection techniques, satellites, not one site for weapons of mass destruction was found. So that was Clapper. Hans Blix, who was head of the International Atomic Energy Agency at the time, commented, you know, it is very, very, very interesting that they had 100% certainty that there were weapons of mass destruction and 0% certainty about where they might be. That's how bad it was. That's Hans Blix, the head of the UN International Atomic Energy Agency. I'm going to show you one more clip. It's about the same length, and this one has to do with this fellow Clapper. Now, Clapper was asked to explain about NSA, and not all the revelations of my friend Edward Snowden had been out in the open yet, and so one of the more tenacious senators we have in our Senate, Ron Wyden, had him before, under oath, had him before Congress to testify about what NSA was doing. And this, again, is only about a minute and a half, so if you fall asleep, remember, it's on the exam. That's a line I use when I'm at universities.
I thank you, and this for you, Director Clapper, again on the surveillance front. And I hope we can do this in just a yes or no answer, because I know Senator Feinstein wants to move on. Last summer, the NSA director was at a conference, and he was asked a question about the NSA surveillance of Americans. He replied, and I quote here, "The story that we have millions or hundreds of millions of dossiers on people is completely false." The reason I'm asking the question is, having served on the committee now for a dozen years, I don't really know what a dossier is in this context. So what I wanted to see is if you could give me a yes or no answer to the question, does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
It does not.
Not wittingly. There are cases where they could inadvertently, perhaps, collect, but not wittingly.
Not wittingly. Well, we know the truth on that, don't we? And we have Edward Snowden to thank for that. Edward Snowden and Clapper and yeah. I have to tell you that having been with Edward Snowden twice now in the last 2 years, I can tell you he's the real deal. I mean, there's nothing fake about that man. He is what he is, and he did what he did from very patriotic reasons, because he took the same oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and he was just aghast at what was happening to our Fourth Amendment. That Fourth Amendment, you know, that was, the British were responsible for that Fourth Amendment. They used to come into the colonists' homes and take their daughters and take their merchandise and so forth. And so our forefathers, our founders, were hell-bent and determined that that would not happen anymore. And so here we have what happened. Now, Clapper, of course, was fired as soon as he lied under oath, correct?
No.
No, he wasn't. Where is he now? What's Clapper doing now? Anybody know? He's the new head of all U.S. intelligence.
Oh boy.
The CIA, the NSA, intelligence of the State Department, the Defense. He is the director of national intelligence. What is the point I'm trying to make here? Your B&D and your government is being fed by a bunch of crooks and liars, okay? You can't trust what they say. Look at their record. Why Obama keeps them on is another story, but he does. Now, what you saw there was an example of something highly unusual. The so-called oversight committees in our Congress, Elizabeth and I call them now the overlook committees. You know, there's no oversight over what's going on. The notion of oversight is ein makaberes Witz. You know, it's a macabre joke. Okay, they do what they want. And I understand it's not very different in this country. I don't know to the extent you do. But, you know, there's secrets and they're all secrets and all that kind of stuff. So that was a very unusual example of Senate oversight. Now, Wyden said, don't you think something should happen to Clapper because he lied under oath? And everybody yawned and said, well, no, he's a really nice fellow. We'll leave him in office. And there's a very important lesson there. The President of the United States is not a free man when it comes to the intelligence services. He's afraid of them.
Yeah, exactly. He's afraid of them.
He was even heard to comment at one fundraising meeting when progressives were criticizing Obama. Mr. President, you're supposed to be a progressive? How can you act the way you're doing? And after they did that about 100 times, he got up and he said, look, don't you remember what happened to Dr. King? He could have said, don't you remember what happened to JFK? Now, you know, it's understandable that he's concerned, but I don't think a person like that should have run for president of the United States if he was going to be so afraid of the intelligence services. I want to fast forward here and talk about some good news. After Iraq, after the debacle having to do with intelligence on Iraq and the destruction of Iraq itself, the people in Washington thought, well, Bush and Cheney, they have their sights set now on Iran. And maybe we need to do a national intelligence estimate on how close Iran is to a nuclear weapon. And somebody said, yeah, you know, we can't go through what we did on Iraq. Let's get somebody honest in to do an estimate, to manage an estimate. And they had to go to the State Department. But they found an honest man, very experienced, very clever. His name was Tom Finger. He's a recipient of our Sam Adams Award for Integrity and Intelligence. He had been the head of the State Department intelligence outfit. He came over, brought some of his expert, honest analysts, and all during 2007, they labored on a bottom-up assessment from all the evidence of where Iran was in terms of building a nuclear weapon. Now, they did this in secret. And they had some luck mid-year when they got some new intelligence. But in November of 2007, they issued a national intelligence estimate unanimously. That means all 16 intelligence agencies of our government. There were only 12 when I was on active duty. All 16, quote, with high confidence judged. Now listen to this. Iran stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and has not resumed work on a nuclear weapon. Now, that judgment was reaffirmed, revalidated every year between 2007, when this estimate came out, and till today. How did Bush and Cheney react to that? Well, we know. You know, Bush wrote a memoir. Now, one distasteful duty of an analyst, intelligence analyst, is to read these memoirs, you know. I don't suggest you buy them. You can get it in the library. But what he said was this: that intelligence estimate, when I had just said that Iran was just on the verge of getting a nuclear weapon, that was an eye popper. That deprived me of the military option. For, this is a quote, how can I justify using our military to attack the nuclear facilities of a country that the intelligence community said has no nuclear weapons program? Bummer. I mean, if they were really concerned about Iran making a nuclear weapon, and they found out this unanimous decision that they hadn't been since 2000, what would have been the normal reaction? Wow, are you sure? Did you check that out? Call the Israelis. Great news. The Iranians are not working on a nuclear weapon. So what I'm saying here is that an honest job was done, and it prevented the war that Cheney and Bush fully intended to start, not finish, before they left office in 2008. So that was a big deal, and it made me proud of the honest analysts and Tom Finger, the guy from the State Department, for doing that. Besides that, they enabled what has come to pass now, the very famous deal with Iran, where people kind of realized that, you know, it's a little bit, what's the word, surrealistic, you know. Those of us who know this story, you know, we say, well, what did we achieve with this deal? Oh, we really put it over on the Iranians. What we did, we say, you must stop. You must stop that nuclear weapons program that we know you stopped 12 years ago. But you know, if that's what it takes, that's all to the good. We can verify this, and of course, that's where the CIA comes in as well. You know, that's where we can assure everyone who's interested, except the most hardliners, that we can make sure that Iran abides by this and continues not to build a nuclear weapon, okay? So that was the good news, and we were kind of happy with that. And also, I'll mention two other things, and that is Syria. You remember Syria in August of 2013, with those chemical weapon attacks on the 21st of August outside Damascus? Do you remember that? The big, now, Obama had said, you know, that would be a red line. You know, if you use nuclear weapons, Bashar al-Assad, that's a red line. And so, guess what happened? There were some attacks there. Now, what did our colleagues say? Well, let's look at the sarin that was used, the nerve gas. It's not from Syrian government stocks. It's homemade stuff. So, Mr. President, you're being mousetrapped, okay? Those people who want you to intervene in this Syrian conflict openly are trying to mousetrap you by going back to what you said, red line, red line, red line, and then accusing Bashar al-Assad, as John Kerry did 35 times before a press conference at the State Department on the 30th of August, 2013. 35 times, one way or another, he said, Bashar al-Assad governed, Bashar al-Assad, Bashar, okay? They all did it, right? Well, what happened? Well, we played a role. Our former colleagues said, look, Mr. President, it ain't so, you know. John Kerry may be really good about driving boats up the Mekong, but he doesn't know much about chemical warfare, and he certainly doesn't know much about our strategic interests. General Dempsey, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, also went to the President. And I remember that Saturday morning, right after Kerry sounded the death knell to Bashar al-Assad and said, we're in position and we have to retaliate, the President got up in the Rose Garden and said, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has told me that our warships are in position to attack Bashar al-Assad's government, but that there is no time sensitivity to this, that we could do that next week or the following week or next month. And so I'm going to Congress to ask for appropriate authorization. Wow, that was new. Who helped on that? Our colleagues, General Dempsey, and also the British, who for the first time in 3,050 years voted against the war. I exaggerate, but only a little bit, okay? You know, the British usually vote for war when people like Tony Blair say, we got to do it. I'm a little prejudiced, I have to admit, because I'm Irish, okay? And my grandfather, my Irish grandfather, took me aside one time. He said, no, Raymond, do you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? I said, yeah, I know. He said, you don't know. No, sit down and I'll tell you. He says, the sun never sets on the British Empire because the good Lord would never trust the British in the dark. Now, who has the black boxes from the Malaysian aircraft? Anybody know? The British. Yeah. Why do the British have the boxes from the Malaysian aircraft? You know, that really stinks. And while I'm on the subject, our colleagues were able to prevent John Kerry from getting up and saying, I have an intelligence assessment that said the Russians or the pro-Russians knocked down that plane. And so we didn't get an intelligence assessment. We got something called a government assessment. A new genre, new animal, okay? What does that mean? That means it was prepared in the White House, not in the intelligence community. So on those two issues, the Syrian gas thing and MH17, I'm proud of our fellow analysts for stepping up and saying, Mr. President, it ain't the way John Kerry said it was. And when John Kerry bragged in September of 2013 that the moderate rebels were gaining strength in Syria, and they were just on the verge of really making a terrific advance, no one believed that. No one in Washington believed that. And besides, he accused the Syrians again of doing the poison gas. So what happened? Well, the next day, Obama arrived in Petersburg for a summit. And that same day, Mr. Putin felt that he had to comment on John Kerry, and he said, "On врет, он знает, что врет, это печально," which means he's lying, he knows he's lying, this is really sad. So as Obama arrives in Petersburg, Putin, now I've never heard a Soviet president or general secretary call our Secretary of State a liar before, but clearly Putin thought he had the goods on, and he knew, I believe, that Obama knew also that Kerry tended to, well, we say, exaggerate. Now, today we have the ISIS thing, right? Okay, and everybody's trying to figure out, well, what about ISIS? What should we do? Should we drone them to death, or what should we do? And we have the kind of situation now where the intelligence community, the honest ones, are preparing papers that are being changed around. Maybe would you like to chat about that, Elizabeth, and talk about General, what's his name, Landry and all that kind of thing? Yeah, good. Elizabeth is, as you can see, much younger than I and much more recent on duty.
So one of actually the last position I had before I retired was as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for the Near East in the National Intelligence Council. And just a few months before I retired, I sat in on a meeting of the National Intelligence Officer for Military Affairs. And this was a meeting to discuss the situation in Iraq following the drawdown of US forces. This was in early 2010. And the National Intelligence Officer for Military Affairs was actually a general. And he was asking the analysts to report on the situation on the ground in Iraq. And all the analysts that were present at the meeting were reporting a great spike in violence around Iraq, that things were not calming down at all as had been anticipated after the drawdown of American forces. But in fact, fighting was multiplying, people were dying at an alarming rate. And when they were reporting about this, the response of the National Intelligence Officer was not to take notes and nod his head and say, okay, this is something I'm going to include in the National Intelligence estimate on this subject. Instead, he said, well, no, that's not what I've been hearing from my sources. I think you must have the wrong information. And as he went down the line, each analyst was reporting the same thing, giving very concrete evidence as to how violence in Iraq was increasing. And it was very clear to me, just as an observer at this meeting, that this National Intelligence Officer for Military Affairs had a preordained agenda, and that he was not going to take into account this information about the real unfortunate situation on the ground in Iraq. Now, what this means is that probably the president was going to get faulty information, maybe information that suited the military, that things were going according to plan in Iraq. And what does that mean in terms of the information that the BND might get from the US? What is this? What are the implications about the information that our allied countries get? So that's something to think about. If intelligence is politicized in the United States, when that migrates abroad, how will your country's policy be then formulated? Are you really getting the information that you need?
Yeah, and right now, as I mentioned, the analysts there, the military analysts are having a heck of a time with their superiors. There are a lot of honest intelligence analysts also in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and they are reporting what they're seeing with ISIS. And they send these reports to their generals, and when they see them published, they've been changed. The analysts are saying, this is a fool's errand. We're not going to ever succeed in this unless we change our tactics. The analysts are saying that the drone warfare is doing two things. It's increasing the recruitment lines behind Al-Qaeda and ISIS recruiting stations, And it's endangering, it's creating more war for all of us. And the generals are saying, oh, we're beginning to win now. We've stopped ISIS. And so this is really, really important because this has hit the press now. 50 intelligence analysts have complained to the Department of Defense Inspector General saying, you know, we write this stuff, we do our best to do an honest job, and then the generals falsify our conclusions. Do you remember what I said about Vietnam? Well, it's happening again. And there are the good news, of course, is there are these analysts that are speaking out, and somebody must have leaked it to the press. The bad news is that the mainstream media is so corrupt that they take dictation, they take notes from what the White House Sprecher says, and they publish that in the New York Times the next day. And so Americans are completely bereft of information. I had a very educated, a very astute gentleman ask me the other day, why did the Russians shoot down that plane over Ukraine? Now, I have to say, 90% of Americans believe the Russians did it. Why? Because that's what they're told by the mainstream media. So we're trying to break through that. The good news is we have a fifth estate now, which is up in the ether somewhere, but I know I can get reliable information out of it. And when we talk about the big decisions that have to be made now, and here in Germany, well, if the war on ISIS is not only going well for us, in other words, if we're not stopping ISIS, but rather counterproductively bombing this and that, or droning this or that, you know, what does that mean? That means that the generals are going to have their 30 years war. I couldn't believe that our generals are talking about a 30 years war. They have no sense of history, that's clear. And they're saying, you know, I thought maybe the Westphalen Treaty put an end to the kinds of 30 years war we're going to have. So what will happen? Well, this thing will just escalate. And as soon as a lot of people in the Near East learn that we couldn't do the drones without Rammstein, that Rammstein is the sine qua non. It's what we need. We can't go somewhere else for a lot of physical reasons and for technical reasons. We couldn't do it on the North Pole or in London or any other place because of the curvature of the Earth. And the reason we can, you know, look, or they have these so-called pilots look down from their screens and say, oh, that guy looks like, yeah, that looks like a terrorist right there. You know, boom, 2 seconds, he's dead, okay? Or his Hyundai is dead, or whoever has his Hyundai is dead, okay? This would add a couple of seconds more if they had to. It would be very expensive to move. They don't know who would take them. But so Rammstein, you know, is really central to all this. And Rammstein is, as I've been told here, German Hoheitsgebiet, okay? And so, you know, when I think about, how, you know, I can understand it's been 70 years since the war, you know. I was really young during the war, but I remember the aftermath of the war, and I remember the Germans and Americans were like this, mostly because of the Soviet threat. Well, you know, the Russian threat is manufactured. The Russian threat in Ukraine all comes from the coup that the United States and others in the EU mounted against the duly elected government of Ukraine. And nobody realizes that. Nobody in the States, they all start with Putin. Putin, very bad. Putin have no shirt on sometimes. Putin ride horse with no shirt on. Putin, very bad. Putin invade Ukraine. Well, that's what they're getting. So what am I saying here? I'm saying here that if we can't make common cause and point out to the world at large, and especially the people here in Germany, that the counterproductive Drohnenkrieg is causing more and more jihadists and lengthening the war against terror, if you want to use that term, if we can't point out how counterproductive it is, then, you know, there's no way to stop it. And you have, that is, you people out here have, if it's a democracy here in Germany, the wherewithal to stop it. What you have to do, in my view, well, I'm told not to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, all right? One can say that, you know, in the 50s and 60s, the Germans were pretty much adolescents, right? You know, they kind of needed to do what the armies said for obvious reasons because of the terrible threat from the east, right? But you guys are Erwachsene now, you know? I mean, hello, grow up. This is not doing any good for Germany. It's endangering you. And when these jihadists find out what a critical role Rammstein plays, then you're going to have a doubled terrorist threat right here in Germany. Because it is fact, it is flat fact, that without Rammstein geht's nicht mit dem Drohnenkrieg, okay? And we need to stop that. We have some video facts that appeal to the pilots. Now, again, these are not pilots with their helmets on, you know, doing a joystick. These are people sitting at little computers with their mouse and saying, ah, that guy looks like a terrorist to me. Yeah. And he's dead, okay? So what we're trying to do is sensitize people. And we're trying to make people realize what this is in a human dimension. And you know, one of the best things I learned on this trip was a story that Elizabeth told me. And it was a story having to do with the last year of her, well, not the last year, but as they were planning the invasion of Iraq. And I think it really speaks volumes. Would you share that with the folks?
Sure. In November 2002, obviously just a few months before the United States launched its attack in Iraq, I was invited as Iraq Analyst, which I was in 2002, to participate in war games that were sponsored by the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the purpose of the war games was to play out various post-war scenarios in Iraq. What would Iraq look like after a U.S. invasion? And so we played the roles of various political factions and such. And on the final day of the war games, I was seated next to a gentleman who was originally from Iraq, but he was American, married to an American, and he was present at the war games because he was the husband of an American professor there. And while we were listening to the conclusions of the war game, I could see that this gentleman, while he had dark glasses on, tears were coming down. I could see the tears on his cheeks. And I turned to him and I asked him, what is wrong? Can I help? And his response to me was, here at this conference, at these war games, we're discussing political, military, strategic implications of a possible war on Iraq, but nobody here is talking about the humanitarian consequences. No one here is talking about the hundreds of thousands and even millions of Iraqi people, and he said, my people, that are going to die. And when he stated this to me, I tried to think of something to console this man, and I couldn't think of anything to say to him. I was sort of stunned into silence. And then at that very moment, I just felt extremely ashamed that I was even there at these war games, because he was absolutely right. Nobody there was discussing the humanitarian aspects, as if these wars were sterile and as if nobody was ever killed. And this is the kind of psychopathic mentality that I find is endemic in Washington, where elites are planning these kinds of wars, these kinds of attacks, thinking only of political, economic, military benefits, profits from selling arms, and the humanitarian equation is just completely removed from the picture.
Two more things.
So, Ray, would you like to
So that is the callousness. That is the, what, ohne Empathie sort of aspect to all this. That is the human dimension. And you know, last time I checked, we're all humans, aren't we? You know, watching those refugees, watching those Flüchtlinge at the Hauptbahnhof yesterday. You know, I said, wow, you know. So let me draw from some stuff that I've learned about German history. How many have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? All right, I have. Okay. How many have heard about Albrecht Haushofer? Ah, some have. Good, good, good. Can I tell you anyway, for those who haven't heard it? Okay, yeah. Albrecht Haushofer was a geologue at the University of Berlin. He had tenure. Some of you know what that means. You know, he was very secure. But as he saw his Jewish people, his Jewish friends being wrapped up, and the gypsies and all, he also had a Gewissen, you know, he also had his conscience, right? And he started speaking out, collected quite a good following, and was wrapped up by the SS and put in another Berlin jail. Now, the SS had this procedure, very orderly, of course. They wouldn't shoot you, as in this prison, or hang you, as with Haushofer's, this guy, the Dietrich Bonhoeffer, okay? Bonhoeffer was hanged. They shoot people in this. So as the Allies came close, they said, well, you must sign a confession. I mean, we can't shoot you until you confess. So Haushofer says, that's crazy. I'm not going to sign any confession, okay? So they shot him anyway. And as they picked him up off the floor, out of his pocket, a little settle, okay? It was his confession, written in the form of a sonnet, okay? It's not very long. Let me recite it to you. Schuld. Doch bin ich schuldig, aber anders als ihr denkt. Ich musste früher meine Pflicht erkennen. Ich musste schärfer Unheil nennen. Mein Urteil habe ich zu lang gedenkt. Ich habe gewarnt, aber nicht genug und klar. Und heute weiß ich, was ich schuldig war. Dr. Martin Luther King said many times, there is such a thing as too late. I'm talking about not only stopping wars, but stopping the internal oppression that we are experiencing in our country, perhaps even yours. If the Drohnenkrieg causes still more real terrorist incidents here, you can expect that kind of repression to come in big time here as we are experiencing it. So there is such a thing as too late. Think about how Haushofer was thinking as they shot him, and think about that confession that he made. And in that same vein, and again keeping in with this Menschlichkeit approach here, you all saw that wonderful. Well, let me ask Elizabeth to talk about a poem that we commissioned to translate it into German. It has to do with a little boy whose picture you've seen recently in the newspaper.
So I'm sure all of you have seen the picture of the little boy, Aylan Kurdi, who was found washed up on the beach. I'd like, if I may, to read a short poem to you. It was actually written by Samah Sabawi, who is a Palestinian-Australian poet and writer who is currently based in Australia. But she grew up in Gaza, and so she is a refugee, a Flüchtling herself. The title of the poem is Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe. Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe. Nicht auf einem Boot von Asylsuchenden. Nicht an der Hand einer Mutter, die ein Kopftuch trägt. Nicht auf dem Arm eines braunhäutigen Vaters. Von niemandem begleitet, den die Welt verteufeln kann. Das Gesicht im Sand öffnet er uns mit seinen für alle Zeiten geschlossenen Augen, die Augen, Er kommt einem so vertraut vor, wie ein Sohn, ein Enkel, ein Neffe, ein kleines Kind auf dem Spielplatz, wie das im Laden nebenan, das uns immer mit großen Augen mustert. Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe. Keine Papiere, kein Visum, kein Ausweis. Ein Opfer unserer Politik. Die Kriege, die wir dort angezettelt haben, lassen uns hier nicht mehr los. Die Stimmen, die wir so lange stumm geschaltet haben, sind auf einmal laut und deutlich zu vernehmen. Ein Bild wiegt 1000 Wörter auf. Doch wie viele Wörter bedarf es, damit wir uns nicht mehr fürchten vor dem anderen? Wie viele Wörter sind nötig, damit wir zu unserer Menschlichkeit stehen? In der Ferienanlage hatte man mit so etwas am wenigsten gerechnet. Die Touristen waren schockiert. Sie wollten doch nur den Sonnenuntergang betrachten und auf dem Strand miteinander schlafen. Er hätte auch an eine andere Küste gespült werden können. Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe, gedankenloser Flüchtling. Warum musste er gerade in unserem Meer ertrinken? Erinnern wir uns, die Palästinenser stellten die erste Welle der Entrechteten in der arabischen Welt dar. Inzwischen sind sie nur noch ein Tropfen im grenzenlosen Ozean von Exil und Leid. Wir lernen daraus, wenn man das Unrecht gären lässt, breitet es sich ins Unermessliche aus. Jeder wird zum Flüchtling. Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe. Sie trieben auf den Wellen vor der Küste Haifas, auf der Flucht vor dem Irgun. Das Gesicht im Sand. Die Nakba ist ansteckend. Wenn sie nicht behandelt und bekämpft wird, breitet sie sich jenseits der Grenzübergänge und des Gazastreifens aus, bis hin nach Syrien, in den Irak, nach Afghanistan, in den Jemen. Ihr Gift verpestet die Gewässer des Mittelmeers. Rotes Hemd, Blue Jeans, kleine Turnschuhe. Er ist schön und unversehrt, das Gesicht im Sand. Die Haie haben ihn nicht gefressen. Sie überließen ihn den größeren Bestien, den Waffenhändlern, Kriegstreibern und Ölscheichs, den Neokonservativen im Westen und den Tyrannen im Osten. Er ist eine Opfergabe für ihr großes Festgelage.